We have the 4 dimensions of character: methods, motivations, evaluations, and purposes. Well, a lot of people say, when you ask them about a character, you ask an author, what is this character's motivation? Well, his motivation is he wants to be president. No, it's not his motivation, that's his purpose. That's what he hopes to achieve. His purpose is to be president. His motivation may be that he had no power as a child. It might be that he wants to be the center of attention. It might be any one of a number of reasons that he's motivated to be president. From any single purpose, it might be the focus of any one of a number of motivations, an infinite number of motivations. And similarly, for any given motivation, there might be any number of purposes that would be the ones selected to fulfill it for a character. Now, if you have just a motivation, and you don't have a purpose, you just feel like, I got to pursue something, I got to get up, I got to do something, but you don't know what. I've got to achieve something, but you don't have anything to achieve. That's being only motivated. And there are characters like that in stories, and there's nothing wrong with it. You may find that you put a lot of different characteristics or elements or traits in your major characters, but in your minor characters, you only put in a few, maybe even only one characteristic in a whole character, because they just come on occasionally to represent that approach to the story's argument. You see, the character elements all represent, at a certain level, the complete spectrum of different mental functions we have in trying to solve a problem, work it out in our heads. In stories, it represents, can we get a little closer on that? In stories, it represents the same thing in the story mind. The different kinds of functions that might be tried, the different kinds of drives that might be tried, the different kinds of evaluations that might be used on the way to trying to resolve the story mind's problem. So, motivations alone, we might just examine a character having only one. Archetypes will have 2 methods, 2 motivations, 2 evaluations, 2 purposes, 1 internal, 1 external for each of the 4 dimensions. Now, characters don't even have to have that, because a player, as we talked about before, is simply a physical host, and a player might be there to simply drop exposition in the storytelling, or a player might be there only for plot convenience, that there has to be somebody there for another character to talk to or to pick up a phone or something. So those players are not really characters. Players only become characters when they represent at least one dramatic function. Now, a character is like a little sack, a little paper sack. And you go down a shelf and you take a few of these characteristics and a few of that, whatever you want, put them in the sack, and once you've used them, they're not on the shelf anymore. You can't use them in another character. That combination or collection of traits is what makes a character. The bag itself is the player or host, and the traits that they contain will remain consistent for the course of the story. The exception to this is if you want to do a handoff where one character has a collection of traits, they die. The bag goes away. And another bag comes in, a new player into the story. And that now takes over all of the characteristics. Exactly the same kind of person, basically, as the character who died, fulfilling the same functions, not going back over the same ground, but carrying the argument forward from that point, much like one would hand off a baton in a race to the next runner. Handing off the functions. You can even have a character who dies and his functions are split between 2 or 3 new characters who come in. You might have a shared role where one character represents, for example, the sidekick, and then he goes on vacation, and another character comes in to represent the sidekick for a while, then he goes back to where he's coming from, and the first character comes back. You'll see that kind of function going on all the time in such things as Silverado, the motion picture. It's a real interesting and not often used technique, but when it's used, you can add a lot of variety by carrying the argument forward by handing off and then handing back characteristics without necessarily killing a character. You can also distribute characteristics to other characters, have a character die, and have other existing characters take on those additional attributes. Just like in real life, when we have someone that is part of our little group that fulfills certain functions, leaves, goes out of town, dies. The other people in that group will attempt to pick up those functions. Now, they may not be as good at it, but they'll still be trying to do the same jobs, and each one will do a little bit of that job, taking up a little of the slack, until somebody else can come in and fulfill at least part of them. So there are a lot of complex things you can do in how you hand these off. But a character is defined by being a collection of specific characteristics that they hold whenever they are in the story, unless they give some up to another character who takes over that part of the function, or unless they get some from another character and then start performing that function. The danger in handing off the characteristics is that you've actually changed the nature of your characters, and you must be sure to let your audience know exactly what characteristics one character is taking over and another will no longer be doing. It's very complicated to try and get this information across to your audience. So you shouldn't do it often, but you can do it to make things a little more interesting. But it will require more explanation, more screen time, more pages in a book, and more thought on your audience's part. You have to give them more credit. Assume an audience that's a little more intelligent and able to follow such things. Okay, so these 4 dimensions of character then, if you have motivations driven by them and you have a purpose, you still won't get there unless you have a method. Only when you have a method can your motivation drive you to use a particular method to arrive at a purpose. And that's as far as most authors go. That's why they have 3 dimensions. But, like all of us, a well-rounded character will also have evaluations. They will also look and say, well, gosh, am I pushing hard enough? Am I headed in the right direction? How are my methods working? Do I need to switch to other methods? The evaluations are the standards by which we determine how things are going. What kind of a course we're taking? Are we actually getting there? What kind of progress are we making? And characters need that as well. They need to question themselves and their methods and their motives and their purposes. Now, to remain a character, they'll question it, but they won't change. The realm of changing, that is reserved for the subjective characters that we'll talk about in a minute. So we've talked about complex characters. They could be even a character with one characteristic, one element out of the 64. It still makes them complex because they're not the typical archetypal character. So even though they have less elements, they're called more complex.